And I encourage everyone. I think that it makes this a better, a richer learning experience when you feel comfortable enough to turn on your microphones and the rest of us can hear another human's voice. If you're not comfortable doing that, that's fine too. I don't want to make anyone feel uncomfortable. So today I'm going to wrap up the discussion on Chapter 5, Crime and Deviance, and I'm going to focus more narrowly, say, on punishment. And so to get there, I want to call up my slides. So I will be leaving my screen in a second here once I get to the slides. Sorry, I'm on the wrong place here. Just one sec. I want the same slide, but a bit later. No. I will be right with you. Okay, so I'm going to switch actually to a website for a second, maybe. So on the screen, do you see now a page that says financial facts on Canadian prisons?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So these facts are a little bit old, not dramatically old, and it's mostly what I want to get on the table is the scale of the expense that the Canadian state devotes to prisons in Canada, because then I want us to try to consider the extent to which punishment fulfills its goals and the extent to which we get what we want, what we expect, what we've been led to believe from this particular investment. Because it's worth noting, and this is the point that the John Howard Society is making on this particular page, that we're spending an awful lot of money, and if we're not getting what we want from it, maybe we could reinvest that money in other things that might be more productive. At the same time, we don't want to give up advantages or even maybe necessary advantages that accrue from having a prison system. So what is it that we see in that? So let me just slide over here. So we get that approximately $20 billion a year is spent on criminal justice in Canada. Now that's all in. That includes provincial, municipal, and federal. And it includes not just the incarceration component, but the administration of criminal justice, so police, courts, and so on. So $20 billion is how much the government, approximately $20 billion is how much the government spent, the governments, so municipal, provincial, and federal governments, all in, that's how much was spent on the administration of justice, which includes, in our case anyway, incarceration. And so on this webpage, we see they compare from the 2018 federal budget how much money we spend on in other departments. So the total budget of the Federal Department of Health is less than $3 billion. Now, it's crucial to understand, in order to really be clear about the comparisons, in Canada, health is a provincial responsibility, and so that the federal government's health budget does not represent the bulk of the amount of money that's spent by the governments on health. But also, what's crucial to remember is that when the government spends money, they're spending the money that they collect from us in taxes. Mostly, they generate revenue also to some small degree, but for the most part, the government budget is run on taxes that are collected from the population. And so, whether it's the federal or the provincial government, as many small c conservative parties accurately say, there's many governments, but there's only one taxpayer. And so, so the key point is that the money's going in, it's coming in from us, and it's going out, and we're spending $20 billion of the tax money on prisons. And so it makes sense to ask, what are we getting from that? And so now I'll return to my slides. Great. This goes more slowly than I expected. So in the textbook, they describe that they make the claim anyway that all societies have, all might be a slight overstatement for methodological reasons, that let's just say that all societies for which we have any evidence impose sanctions on the people who fail to be constrained by the norms that are in place in a society. And the sanctions that are imposed, we call punishments. And so the phenomenon, the social phenomenon of punishment, broadly speaking, is as close to a social universal as we have available to us. Anthropological, historical, and contemporary evidence, all of these support the contention that not only that norms are a feature of all organized human societies, but that a corollary feature of this universal feature of human society is that there are publicly acknowledged, publicly accepted sanctions that are imposed on and are self-imposed. And so, and we'll take a look at that in a second. But these sanctions are imposed on people who break the norms, and the sanctions themselves are endorsed in the same kind of way as the norms themselves in the first place. So norms logically include in them the possibility, at least, of undesired consequences for the breach of those norms. Okay, so punishment happens. Now I want to skip over the medicalization part of this. It's interesting, but we only have so much time, and I almost always run out of time. So now, in general, in modern societies, in industrialized societies with formalized government systems, and in democratic societies, and societies where there is an organized electoral form of the regulation of society, there are typically four kinds of explanations that are given for, four kinds of justifications that are given for the existence of prisons. But I want to spend a minute or two considering the very need for justifications. Why does punishment require justification? Isn't it self-evident that a society needs an institution like prisons, an institution through which punishment will be administered for rule breakers? Is that self-evidently the case? Another way of putting the same question is, could you imagine Canadian society without any prisons, without the threat of imprisonment backing up the criminal law? What do you think Canadian society would look like if we, sure, by all means?
Oh, actually, I accidentally meant speak, but
Okay, that would
wrote
be
the
even
wrong
better.
thing.
Even better.
I think it would be different. I'm not sure if I would like it or not, but I think maybe it would be maybe more dangerous, I guess. Like I think there's some crimes that aren't like very serious that like you shouldn't be thrown in jail for, but there's some people who like I think really need to be like just removed from the population. And without prisons, I'm not sure how we would deal with these just like animals, right? Like to me, that's sort of spooky. Like I don't like the idea of these people like being around us, like if they have bad intentions, right? And that's just my like 2 cents.
Right. So, but the starting point from my question is, I think what you're describing is a very widely shared sentiment, and it's more than just I think. Survey data done in Ontario, in Canada, and in many ways, and more broadly around the world, there's widespread agreement for that general position. And the idea is that it's in order to make us feel, we have prisons in order to make us feel safer, and that the making us feel safer is what justifies there being a prison. But what is it about putting someone in jail that requires an explanation in the first place? Or is there something that requires an explanation in the first place?
I'm a bit confused with the question. Can you phrase it differently?
Okay, sure. Thank you. On what basis, then, I'll jump ahead one step, I guess. What right does the government have of putting anyone in jail?
Oh, okay. I would say they have the right of putting people in jail when they become damaging towards society or towards individuals in society, or like even in some occasions damaging to themselves, right? Like that's the same reason we put people who do meth in jail, right? It's because it's so damaging to them to be outside where the freedom to like access these things, it pretty much makes them slaves to their own desires. I don't think they should be thrown in jail, but I think that's the general agreement with the use of prisons.
But how does the government have the right to do that? Where does the right that the government? I think drugs are a good example for the philosophical problem of prison in the first place. So I can drink myself stupid without ever, as long as I just stay in my house, I can drink myself stupid from morning to night all of my life and die that way, and I'll never ever go to jail. But if I do meth with the same ultimate result of destroying my life, right? Meth is illegal even if you don't harm anybody else. The government picks meth. Meth is illegal, but booze is okay. Where does the government get off telling me that I can do booze, but I can't do meth. Why is it any of your business, not just you, Matthew, but everybody else in Canada, if I want to do meth, why shouldn't I be allowed to do meth? How does the government have an opinion on this even? I don't do meth, by the way.
Well, I would say like the reason some drugs are legal and some aren't is societal standards, right? Like if you tried banning alcohol, people would freak out. But if you tried like keeping meth illegal, people think it's reasonable because the differences between the damaging effects of these drugs, although both are damaging, it's more, I guess, visible with like methamphetamines or PCP or other hard drugs like that.
Well,
But I would
the
say the
data,
government has
it's
the
crystal clear, and everybody knows that alcohol overall, in terms of the health damage on the Canadian population as a whole, is much, much greater. Also, I wouldn't even be surprised if refined sugar separate. I mean, you need refined sugar to make most alcohols, but refined sugar probably on its own causes more health problems, and maybe even cheese, but let's not go there. My broader point is that the government, society, through the government, picks and chooses some of these and leaves others go. Another, I think, at least arguably connected version of this is well, how is it possible that we're letting Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos get away with what they're doing? Aren't they causing more harm than all of this other stuff? Bezos is going to be worth $1 trillion soon. Bezos's wealth over the course of COVID has gone up some insane amount. Why don't we just take his money? If the only question is what's good for the most number of people in our society, shouldn't we just go get the money of all the really, really rich people and spread it and split it up between all the rest of us?
I mean, like I think these people are pretty damaging to society on their own. Like I don't know, my opinion
Sorry,
on these sort of things are like,
who
you know,
are these people in your sentence?
I would say people who are extremely wealthy with no loyalty to the country, with no loyalty to Canadians. You know, they don't care about us. They're just in there for the money. You know, the human rights violations for these companies are just insane. A lot of them, you know, like Nike, you know, these companies, they don't care about us. Like they're here for money. And like, make no mistake, like if they could do the same they were doing to kids over there, they would put us in factories. Like I don't think we should have any loyalty towards them. They don't have any to us. It's our people first, our people above everything, in my opinion. Like that's how we should make any policy.
Okay, so I've allowed myself to get a little bit off track. What I want to get back to is I want to consider the fact of punishment, and I want to at least raise some skepticism about so it's widely accepted. There is not a very big push in Canada to eliminate prison sentences. There's more or less fairly strong support in wide sections of the population across all kinds of different demographic sectors, class, gender, ethnic. Prisons are well supported in our society. And in order to decide whether we're getting our money's worth out of prisons, I want to take a look at the 4 different kinds of justifications that were offered for prisons. The reason I raised the issue of the super wealthy was followed up on Matthew's point about drugs. And I just wanted to point out to you that society, or that the government, and insofar as the government is reflecting society's wishes, and there's an argument to be had about the connection between society and government, but whatever that connection is, government has landed on the position that they pick and choose which negative consequences they're going to punish, which negative consequences they're going to ignore. And it doesn't always reduce back simply to the amount of damage. We allow more damage from alcohol than we do, we experience more damage socially from alcohol than we do from methamphetamine, at least arguably. And so as a result of that, the argument that we made meth illegal and we left alcohol legal doesn't work if we just try to consider it in terms of the amount of damage to society. Something else is going on as well. Why did we pick one over the other? So, and I want to suggest that prison also is part of this arbitrariness. Matthew, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just like to say also that I think based upon people have been drinking for millennia, right? Like banning alcohol, like even if like I wouldn't mind if it got banned personally. I don't care. But I know that if we tried banning it, the public reaction to that would be insane, right? Same with cigarettes. And maybe even marijuana now, right?
And murder. People have been murdering for millennia, and we still punish murder.
Yeah, but like most people don't like desire to murder people, or if they do, they don't act out in their fantasy, right? Like alcohol is like
Exactly. That's the
horrible and
point that
cheap.
that's the point I want to land on, or that's one sociologically important dynamic that needs to be considered. Why is it that more people don't murder? Why is it that more people don't steal? Almost everybody would like to have more money. Probably not absolutely everybody, but almost everybody would like to have more money. But most of us don't steal. Is it the case that we don't steal? And what, so the question is, what role does prison as a punishment, as a possible punishment, as an actual punishment, what role does the existence of prison in support of criminal law play in keeping us from stealing as much, keep from stealing as much as we might like to? It's an open-ended question. Go ahead, Matthew.
I'm not sure if it actually works, but I think the idea is like if let's say I wanted to steal something and I'm in my first year of college, if I steal something like large enough, I could go to jail for several years. And that's a long amount of time, right? It's a lot of time lost, a lot of experiences lost, all because I did this one thing, right? I think the idea is if you do it, there will be this punishment. So
Right.
you should not do it.
Yes. Well, so hang on. Should is a trickier thing here, but if you leave out that point about should, if you don't want to do the time, don't do the crime. So deterrence. Now, the social scientific problem there is that there's no available evidence to demonstrate that deterrence works in the common sense way that many of us think deterrence should work. Increasing jail sentences cannot be demonstrated using social scientific methods to decrease the instance of the crime targeted by that particular penalty. So with murder, with drinking and driving, with multiple different kinds of offenses in all kinds of different jurisdictions, the data has been analyzed by social scientists, by criminologists and statisticians, and they're unable to demonstrate a significant decrease in a particular crime that follows from an increase in the penalty for that crime. It just doesn't work, or we're unable to demonstrate a causal connection or even a statistically significant correlation between increasing penalties and decreasing crime. So that leads to certain kinds of questions. Now, one issue that's not touched by this, that is not, I don't think, a negligible issue, is we feel safer from crime when we know that there's more punishment. Now, I don't mean me particularly. I don't. I'm against prisons. I don't think prisons work, and I think they're a bad idea. Um, but separately for me, taking me out of the equation, when surveys are done, there's results that confirm this, and in a more immediately practical way, politicians and political parties have a great deal of trouble. Almost all political parties in Canada understand that if they could lower taxes without damaging Canadian society, that many, many, many voters would find that to be a very popular option. But almost none of the political parties that are successful enough in collecting votes at election time put forward a program that says, well, look, we can save $20 billion. We'll just stop punishing people. Nobody's saying that. Even though there's loads of social scientific evidence to put some pressure on the effectiveness of prisons in doing two of these four things. So what are the four things? Rehabilitation, deterrence, revenge, and incapacitation. The social scientific data is pretty clear that at the levels at which it's being carried out now, rehabilitation is not working and deterrence is not working. Revenge and incapacitation is what I want to take a look at for a few minutes. Does it make sense? What possible advantages might there be to society in having an institution of revenge? Or, well, in what way is punishment revenge? Let's clear that up first, maybe. Right. So, and I want to clarify one feature of how the public justice system works in Canada, in the United States, in England, in France, in many, many countries that I'm familiar with, and I expect in most of the other countries with which I'm much less familiar. Let's say that citizen X is arrested and charged and convicted of having assaulted his sociology professor. So he punched his prof in the face. The police arrest him. He's charged. He's convicted. Or sorry, he's arrested and he's charged. When he goes to trial, it's not the sociology professor who has to make the case. What is going on in a criminal act is the claim. It's the Crown that prosecutes the suspect, the prisoner. What's the terminology here? The Crown prosecutes the person who's been charged. In a criminal proceeding, the crime is against society in the first instance. So although he broke my nose, I'm the sociology professor, I got punched in the face, it's not me. I might have to press charges, but I'm not the one who carries out the crime. Hasn't been committed in the first instance against me. It's against the law for everybody to punch anybody else. And when you punch someone, what you've done is you haven't just punched that one person, you've broken the law that holds all of us in check. And so it's all of society. So when they say it's the Crown, that's meant more or less metaphorically to represent society as a whole. You've committed an offense. This person has committed an offense against all of us. You've disturbed the peace. You've made it more difficult for all of us to carry out all of our interactions because you broke one of those rules that is believed to be so fundamentally necessary for the normal carrying out of all of our interactions, that we're all going to agree that we're going to take this otherwise extraordinary step, not just of spending money on this, but of depriving you of what we mostly consider to be the one thing we're most keen on being able to preserve, and that is our freedom. And so when we describe it in terms of revenge, it's not my revenge against the person who punched me in the face. It's all of us claiming revenge against that person, not only for having punched me, but for having broken the law in a certain way. The idea is that when he punched me, he punched all of us. Now, I think it was Patrick who typed something up, but let me just see who it was. I don't know how to find these things. No, it was Matthew, sorry. So Matthew typed, people feel good when people who commit horrible crimes are punished. But I think it's worth dialing it back a little bit and trying to see the functioning of crime and punishment in its more or less everyday manifestation. Certainly, I think it's pretty clearly the case, maybe not quite certainly, it's pretty clearly the case that many, many people feel good when someone who's committed a horrible crime has been punished. But most crimes, just by virtue of the meaning of the thing, are not horrible crimes. They're sort of everyday crimes. We all feel, many of us will feel good if we read in the newspaper or see on TV that some mass murderer has been arrested and will be punished for having murdered 50 children or something along those lines. But mostly with the prison, if you went and watched criminal trials, it's mostly not mass murders. It's mostly more or less everyday offenses. And if we're going to characterize imprisonment as a form of punishment as revenge, then we're not going to be looking at these statistically exceptional crimes. We want to understand what's going on in the everyday crimes. That we're going to exact revenge from the person who stole a bicycle, philosophically speaking, in principle, on the same basis as we're going to feel good about the revenge that we're exacting from the mass murderer. And it's on a scale and there's proportionality included, but still the idea is we want to get revenge. Now, the idea of revenge is that through the infliction of punishment on someone who contravened our rules, we're restoring balance to the equilibrium that existed prior to the disturbance of that equilibrium. So yesterday, maybe it was the day before now, some guy in Colorado walked into a grocery store and killed, I think it's 10 people. And that comes much closer to a horrible crime than stealing a bicycle. And the governor of Colorado was quoted as saying that one aspect of the despicableness of what this person, if in fact it was him, I'm pretty sure it was him, but let's say it was him, what he did was that he went into a grocery store. And in a grocery store, most of us feel safe almost all the time. If we can't even go get groceries and feel safe, then what's the point of having society at all? To restore that feeling of safety in the grocery store requires some kind of public action. And it brings us all together when the person who's disturbed this safety, this equilibrium that we experience in our everyday lives, then that helps us get back to that equilibrium. Does that make sense? Does that seem like part of what's going on? So revenge is one thing that prisons possibly do. I want to come back to that in a second. The last. So rehabilitation and deterrence are problematic outcomes of prisons. Revenge is less problematic as an outcome, but there are some challenges there still. I want to go through the last one before I come back to revenge. Now, what about incapacitation? In what way does prison serve as, and in what sense of incapacitation does a prison serve as an institution of incapacitation? Well, let's go back to my example of someone who's been arrested. Oh, go ahead, Matthew.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, I would say it restricts the freedoms of people. Well, like arguable if it's good or bad that it does, but I would say it serves as a way to physically restrict people's freedoms with
Right.
violent power.
I'm describing I'm describing prisons as an institution of incapacitation as one of the goals of incarceration. So we're going to keep prisons going as long as they meet their own goals. Why is that a goal that's worth pursuing? What does society get from incapacitating the people who've been convicted of the crime? It's an obvious thing. I just want to hear it spelled out.
Well, I would say if you get everyone in a gang in a certain area in jail, then now suddenly there's not going to be that gang there, right? That's an example, but I would say the goal is to just remove troubling elements to society and basically, I guess you could say, segregate them away from everyone.
Right, exactly. So what happens is, with the example of the person who punched the sociology professor in the face, so I imagine that the sociology professor would feel a little bit safer, but I would also easily enough imagine, so picture yourselves in a classroom where the sociology professor says that he doesn't believe in prisons, and someone in the classroom disagrees strongly with that claim and walks up and punches the prof in the face. So the prof is very likely to feel much less safe in that work environment in the future, knowing that this person is out there still disagreeing with him or still feeling like he can punch him in the face. But it would also be disturbing for many other people in the classroom. Your own sense of safety in that classroom would be compromised by that experience. One of the ways of restoring your sense of safety in the classroom would be the knowledge that the person who disturbed that sense of safety in the first place was now, his freedom was taken away. He's locked up somewhere. He can't come back to Seneca to start punching people in the face. That's more or less the same argument you were making, Matthew, I think, right? Is that the same argument you were making?
Yeah, I would say that's exactly the same.
Right. So prisons do achieve that goal. The people who are doing this are incapacitated. So we are getting some revenge and we are getting some incapacitation. So I want to revisit revenge for a second. The problem is that not everybody agrees that revenge is a good thing. And it's not clear either that revenge achieves the goal for which, so that while it's pretty clear that many people get some short-term satisfaction from revenge, what's not clear is the extent to which that social equilibrium, that is the restoring of that social equilibrium, that is the initial goal of, or the initial justification for revenge in the first place, is actually achieved. Now, there are all kinds of challenges there. In a society where a segment of the population feels like the law is skewed against them in the first place, resetting the equilibrium doesn't make sense for that segment of the population. If the game is already rigged against you, then you're not going to really feel that good about the game being reset to that standard. And so, in the sense of punishment being an institution of revenge, that's going to make much more sense for people who are benefiting from society's organization, but it's going to make less sense for people who don't feel right, even if they're wrong about this. But if they don't feel like society is organized for their benefit, then they're not going to feel better about ensuring that society is devoting resources to continue to work against their own benefit. So my point here is that the prison system is predicated on the assumption that society is working well enough as it is now that it makes sense to go to $20 billion worth of expenses, and it makes sense to give the government the authority to lock people up in the context in which we are living right now. If you don't trust the government in the first place, whether you're right or wrong, then giving the government extra powers to do things when you don't trust them is going to be problematic, at least for those people who don't trust the government. Does that seem logical?
I think so.
Right. And that's in part why Black Lives Matter, one of the main, most publicly circulated anyway, goals of the Black Lives Matter movement is against the prison system, against the police infrastructure, to defund the police and defund the prison system. It's because it makes sense, at least in part, to the degree that the criminal justice system is skewed against Black people to start with. If the laws that we have are unfair, then enforcing those laws is only going to benefit those people for whom that law is already benefiting, and it's not going to benefit those people that law is not benefiting. Okay, so some of what this argument is intended to lead to is I'm setting it up for next week's lecture, where I'm going to compare the functionalist and the conflict theory accounts of social stratification. Why is it? What are some of the different sociological explanations that have been provided to explain why societies remain unequal from a socioeconomic point of view? Why is it not only is there a gap between the rich and the poor in Canada and in the United States and in many places, but on many, many measures, that gap is increasing, not decreasing. And so the conflict theory approach to that has one kind of answer, and the functionalist approach to that has a very different kind of explanation. And both of those theories are also available to describe what's going on with prisons and with punishment. But we're not going to have a chance to discuss that part of it today. I want to go to now take a look at another feature. Let me just make this a bit bigger. When we consider, so I started out with the view that many people in Canada, there's a fairly solid agreement in the population that overall punishment, criminal punishment, incarceration for certain acts of deviance is a legitimate strategy, and that it's a good policy idea. But when we take a look, when we make international comparisons, we see that there's a fairly dramatic range in the extent of which imprisonment and punishment are applied, are being used. The United States, by a long shot, by a very large, there's a very large gap between the US and most of the other countries that are comparable in many other respects to the US in the rate of incarceration that's applied. The US puts more people in prison than anywhere else in the world, and they at a much higher, so they have a large population, so that in part explains that. But when you divide it by the total population, so what this is the rate of people per 100,000 population. So here they've averaged it out so that this is an apples to apples comparison. For every 100,000 people in the US population, 666 are in prison, whereas in Canada, it's only 114 people per 100,000 population. If punishment was that natural a kind of response, we would expect more something along these lines. That between 143 and 114, these are that gap represents a much more understandable variation. It's not a difference in order of magnitude. Here, there are all kinds of different explanations for why it is that there might be that kind of variation. But the variation between 143 or 118 or 114 and 666, that takes that kind of explanation off the table, basically. Something else must be going on other than simply a natural, spontaneous social response. So something's going on. Now, what alternatives are there? That's what I want to. So I'm going to skip forward here. I'm going to skip over. So, other forms of punishment. Now, we could achieve revenge and we could achieve incapacitation less expensively, at least arguably less expensively. We probably would have to make a few other adjustments, but we could achieve them less expensively, arguably less expensively, and certainly more completely if we reinstituted the death penalty. Obviously, rehabilitation goes out the window with death penalty, but revenge and incapacitation are achieved absolutely with the death penalty. But in Canada, we don't do that. Why do you think, first of all, well, no, let's just skip that. Why do you think the death penalty is not reintroduced into Canada? Do any of you have any opinions? Yeah, Matthew?
I think it's because most Canadians don't support it for moral reasons. I think that's the large reason.
Why is that the case? That's the question. Why don't more people? Well, actually, but the thing is, survey data shows that depending on how you ask the question, you get more or less support. But a majority of the population in Canada, in fact, supports reinstituting the death penalty. You can ask the question in a variety of different ways to move the needle a little bit, but there's fairly strong support in Canada for the reintroduction of the death penalty. And yet the government hasn't done it. And even the Conservative Party, who for other kinds of reasons perhaps, has not put that in their platforms when they seek election or re-election.
Well, I didn't know that actually most people supported it, but
half. I don't mean 90%. I mean on the order of 60%.
Well, I would say then that the reason it won't get reinstituted, even if 60% of people wanted to, would be that the parties that want to institute it, like the Conservatives, like at least where there's some people who are interested, their voting base that they're trying to gain right now, that demographic is not going to support the death penalty, right? So I'd say it's pragmatism over what they think is right, I would say, which sums up the conservatives pretty well, I would say.
Perhaps. But so for a number of different reasons, I'm going to leave that partisan set of arguments to the side. What I want to focus on more is I want to reframe my question. Not why do you think the government doesn't do it, but rather why do you think, if you think it should be reintroduced, why do you think it should be reintroduced? Why do you think that people who want it reintroduced want it reintroduced?
Okay, I'll speak for myself because I do want it reintroduced.
Yeah.
I would say it should be reintroduced under very, very specific circumstances. Like some people simply, I don't think are worth redeeming, right? You like child molesters. I don't think we can bring them back, right? Like I think once you step that far, you're a bit too out there for me, right? Or like serial killers, or at that point, I think it's these people are so unredeemable and their crimes are so morally horrible that I don't think keeping them alive is quite literally worth the cost, right? Like I think you mentioned 100,000 per person a year. Like I think a bullet would be a far cheaper solution. Is that may be very extremist and quite brutal, but that's my honest opinion.
Right. So, but then if we just go back, assuming that what you're talking about doing it through a system of law rather than some sort of vigilante secret thing, which isn't really a possibility.
Yeah, I'm not doing that.
How would that? So there's no rehabilitation, right? If we have the death penalty, the person's not being rehabilitated. We've given up on rehabilitation, and then so the question of deterrence comes up. Is the death penalty a deterrent? And here again, the evidence is even more clearer, and it's been studied more extensively. The death penalty does not act as a deterrent to other people. It deters the person who's been incapacitated. Once you've been executed, you cannot come, you're not killing anybody else again, but it doesn't have general deterrence. We're not sure why. It's that's, let's say, more or less a secondary issue, but it's really fairly clear within the framework of any legal system that we can imagine achieving all of the other goals of a legal system. We don't know how to implement a death penalty that has the effect of deterring the acts that are whose deterrence is being aimed at. And so it comes back to revenge and incapacitation. And is it worth it? And so it remains kind of an open question. Why is it that 60% of the Canadian people, there's two analytically separable questions. Why do 60% of the population want to give the government the authority to kill its own citizens? And one part of the explanation is we can get the revenge and we can get the incapacitation without having to go all the way to giving the government the authority to kill. We can keep them in jail, and we can keep them incapacitated, and we can exact our revenge, if that's what we want, on the people who've committed the crimes that we've decided are so heinous that they must be met with this one extreme measure, life in prison with no chance of parole. At least arguably, the amount of pain is greater with a life in jail with the certain knowledge you will never get out than it would be by being executed. I think reasonable people maybe can disagree about that, but at least a rational argument can be made. Matthew, go ahead.
I don't know. I mean, like for me, I just think of it as like a financial thing. Like that's pretty rough. But if these people aren't contributing anything, and they've only ever caused extreme hardship for people and just horrible actions, like
You know, like especially murderers, like I don't see the point in keeping them around if they're not like, if it's gonna sound bad, but if they're not like working, like what's the point?
Well, so what if they are working? I think most murderers did have a job. I don't think on TV, it's fine to have these contract killers whose only job is to go around murdering people. But I bet if you took a look at everybody who's in prison right now in Canada for murder, the majority of them had jobs. Their main job wasn't being a murderer. Their main job was something else. Now, that main other job might have been, uh, you know, other bad things, but the main job wasn't being a murderer. But on the money side, just before we finish, or before dealing with Matthew's point, I want to make a claim. I want to highlight for you one feature of where all of this cost goes to. So, of that $109,000 per inmate, per federal inmate, 70% of that goes to salaries for employees. So the warden and the guards and the cleaners and the electricians and so on in the penitentiaries, they account for 70% of that money. By and large in Canada, federal penitentiary jobs are very good jobs. These are high paying, relatively speaking, high paying jobs. And that money circulates right back into our economy. And so most of the cost, if we, I mean, I'm not sure how many murders there are in a year, but if we executed every one of them, it would only decrease the overall cost by a small amount. And it certainly wouldn't be enough to close any prisons. We wouldn't really be saving much on the operational cost of the prisons by executing murderers. And so if you combine that with the evidence that executing murderers doesn't decrease the number of murders, we still really wouldn't be solving any problems, most of the problems. We'd be rid of Joe Smith, who murdered the sociology professor. So this year, but what we have no reason to expect we'd get next year would be a lower murder rate. And in general, policy is future oriented. We're more interested, and there are more social benefits to decreasing the number of murders next year than we are interested in handling the number of murders that have already happened. We're primarily interested in the amount of crime we have now because of its ongoing consequences rather than because of its past consequences. And so the problem with prisons is that it doesn't seem to achieve that outcome. And certainly capital punishment, by very, very, very strong consensus among social scientists. I do want to stress, I want to acknowledge anyway, that it's counterintuitive. Lots of people who support capital punishment, they simply just don't believe that the numbers prove what the numbers claim to show. And so that in part explains why support for the reinstitution of capital punishment in Canada is still pretty high. Consider, just as a parallel kind of argument, lots and lots of people in Canada are skeptical about scientists. And so I think that if you're skeptical about natural science, generally you're, I think, pretty likely to be skeptical about, and I don't even think you're necessarily mistaken here, to be skeptical about social sciences, where the proof and the logic of the arguments are much, much more complicated and much, much less certain, right? Force equals mass times acceleration. Physicists are all over that. But the connections, the complex connections that are the object of social sciences produce much less certainty, much less scientific law-like behavior. Now, the other consideration, the last consideration I want to briefly address, I want to get to my slide here. There's decriminalization. So that was put into place, and decriminalization, for example, the decriminalization of marijuana, it's too new to be able to. I mean, it's too recent a transformation in the in Canadian society to be able to be clear about what's going to happen. But in the medium and longer term, it's almost certain to save money if we don't not only don't put people in jail for marijuana possession, but we don't have uh, police officers devoting their time to pursuing that act of possessing marijuana, growing marijuana, selling marijuana, and buying marijuana. The police can then divert their attention to fighting or responding to all kinds of other crimes whose impact on society by very broad consensus is more significant. So the police budget would be either better spent or just diminished. Same with the court time, same with the prison time, same with the penitentiary time. By decriminalizing marijuana, we're saving money and we're reallocating resources. We have at least the option of resources in a way that is more potentially more productive. So decriminalization and the legalization of certain actions, especially those actions for which there is a diminishing consensus in society that they represent a harm to our society. And then finally, restorative justice. The book and the chapter in our textbook ends with a very brief account of the social scientific data on restorative justice. And it turns out, and surveys have been done about this, when one of the key elements of restorative justice is that it brings together the victim of the crime and the perpetrator of the crime. Our criminal justice system, for the most part, leaves the victims of crimes largely outside of the administration of justice. And while it seems like a common sense thing that the victim of a crime will feel vindicated and will feel like they've been made whole by the infliction of punishment on that criminal, when compared to restorative justice, that is, where the victim has had the opportunity over time to meet with the person who harmed them and to discuss what went on, the victims of the crime feel better about it than they do compared to how the victims of the crime feel as a result of the normal criminal justice procedures. Now, there are all kinds of methodological challenges that remain to be addressed by the social science, by sociologists and criminologists. The size of the database on the basis of which these conclusions have been drawn is still, relatively speaking, pretty small. And the stakes are very high. The kinds of crimes that are amenable to restorative justice actions is fairly narrow. And so those in some ways are the easiest crimes to achieve some sort of benefit. But even within that limited scope, there are many advantages to pursuing a restorative justice approach. Okay, so I've gone over my time. So I'll just wrap it up here. I'm going to turn off the recording part